talking really about kind of the future of open source in some ways and some of the challenges that are, facing the open source community from continuing the great work that's been done over the last 30 or 40 years. Before we get going, though, for folks who aren't familiar with you or don't know of you, just talk a little bit about yourself and the work that you do there at GitHub.
Yeah, so my name's Abby. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. It's getting a little bit chilly here, which is kind of nice after a hot summer.
Leaves
But I
turning? Are the
run,
leaves turning?
not yet, soon, I think. We'll see.
Yeah,
Are they turning there in Boston?
not
Not
yet.
yet. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
it's been
soon.
too
It'll be
warm.
beautiful.
Yeah, trees haven't gotten the
Uh,
message, but they will. They will soon.
soon, yeah. It's September. It has a bit of time. But I run open source maintainer programs at GitHub. And I actually started my career at a cancer research institute. So I was writing software for scientists, and my grandmother had passed away from cancer. So this is really meaningful work for me. And when I was there, I saw how incredible open source was for innovation. Like scientists in Japan were collaborating with researchers in the UK, and that was all because of some tools that I was writing in the open. So that's where I really saw the power of open source. And then when Mozilla launched Mozilla Science Lab, I went over there just to help more scientists do open source well. And slowly my role shifted to the broader open source ecosystem, because I do think open source is the best way that we can innovate and make the best discoveries that we can for our world. And now that's brought me to GitHub, where I can actually work with maintainers every day and make sure that we're solving the problems that they really need right now. And a big one right now is the graying of open source and this need for the next generation.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that kind of got you on ConversingLabs radar was this really pretty thought-provoking blog post that you wrote for GitHub, Who Will Maintain the Future, and kind of rethinking open source leadership for a new generation. One of the things you pointed out was data from this maintainer survey that this organization Tidelift did that just showed that the population of open source maintainers is aging rapidly. It's more than the percentage of maintainers age 46 to 65 has doubled just in the last 4 or 5 years. And at the same time, the percentage of maintainers at a younger age, kind of 20, 26 or younger, has shrunken. What put that on your radar? Is that something that you have observed directly at GitHub? Talk just a little bit about that research and also what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's something that I've been seeing over the last few years, but reading that research, really, I didn't know it was that bad. Just seeing the numbers is like, oh, that's a really big drop in young contributors. And it really hit home to me because when I was a student in university, I had joined this campus club, and I was one of 2 first-year students that showed up at the first meeting that year. Everyone else was like third year or fourth year. And like that club was great. Like some of them are still my friends today. Shout out to Lee Mark Lau. But I in the next few years, all of the people that were leading the club graduated, and then I had to step up. And looking back, I really wasn't ready for it, and it was a lot of work getting new people in. And one of my big focuses after that first year, where I was the only one of 2 who joined, I realized we needed to make sure first-year students were joining so that the club can just keep continuing over the years. So I'm seeing that happen in open source today, where graying isn't inherently bad, but life changes. People start families, they can't do their open source as much anymore, they're retiring. And the problem is we don't have the next generation coming in, and that's what the numbers are showing us. The next generation isn't stepping up. So yeah, I wrote this blog post just to start thinking about what we could do about that.
Yeah. And I mean, this is an issue that many organizations face, right? I mean, many industries face as well. Based on the work that you do or you've done at GitHub working with maintainers, I mean, do you see the consequences of this actually playing out, of this sort of, like you were saying, the sort of aging of the maintainer population, and also corresponding with that, a lack of engagement, investment from folks who are younger and more able to contribute?
Yeah, I'd say one of the number one concerns I hear is about burnout. So many maintainers are just overworked and they're just unable to keep up with everything that's going on. They get burned out. and then there's no one to step up, and there's no one to just help share the load in the first place. So that's a big
Right.
one. But also like retiring, that's a big one, and just aging generally.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because if you look back at the open source movement,
Mhm.
going back 30 years, what have you, it was really fueled by young
Yeah.
engineers, software developers, right? And in some ways, it was a way to sort of, you know, get your career started, right? You could contribute to open source projects, and that would hone your skills, also give you kind of a network that you might use professionally as you went out look for jobs. It's something you could point to and say, well, this is evidence of the work that I've done, right? I did this, code update to this project, or I'm a maintainer here. Does that dynamic? I mean, we'll talk about AI and stuff. I mean, obviously, the software development
Yeah.
field and profession is changing as we speak.
Yes.
But that's recent. I mean, is that dynamic changing? Do you think of how younger people are kind of coming into software development as a profession?
And I think the opportunity is still there for younger people to come in and like make their name in open source. I think sometimes it's a little bit harder because a lot of open source is more established, so contributing to a big project is a bit intimidating. But one thing that I put in the blog post was an exercise that I did with Mozilla for a long time is personas and pathways, where I encourage projects to think of personas to represent the diversity that they want to see in their project, the diversity of contributors they want to see in their project. So taking that idea, let's think about what the Gen Z persona looks like and what research says about Gen Z. Um, and it was interesting how a lot of them are digital natives, very aware of like how to do things and how to code often, but they're a little bit a little bit wary of just completely open platforms. So they prefer things like Discord, where it's like a little bit gated and they can experiment without fear of like being cringe
Right.
or yeah, being too exposed. And open source very much has this mindset right now of like, oh, just try it, just jump in and contribute. But that's often a little bit too high of a bar for the average Gen Z person right now, based on what we've seen with the research. So things like mentorship or just more sandbox spaces could make a big difference there. But
Yeah.
yeah, we are seeing less Gen Z, but I think it's more of us not, how to phrase this. But yeah, like they're not as aware of open source, and there's isn't an easy onboarding for their generation compared to ours.
Right. And in some ways, the processes and structures that exist were
Mm.
created by like Gen X people like myself,
Mhm.
and with a different, and using different technologies with different
Mm.
capabilities, right? I mean, things like Discord did not exist,
Yeah.
25, 30 years ago. But today they do, and there is so much you can do with those. But yeah, I mean, that would seem to be a problem, is needing to kind of bring those in line with the types of experiences and online communities that younger people are accustomed to.
Mhm.
Um, let's talk about, I mean, one of the big challenges I see is just the huge number of legacy open source projects that are out there that
Yes.
need help
Mhm.
from could use new young people. And we saw this play out from a security standpoint with like XE-utils, right? Hugely
Mhm.
important, encryption program, single maintainer, really burned out and was able to
Mhm.
get kind of manipulated by malicious actors who got maintainer level access to that
Yeah.
project. Fortunately, it got sniffed out early, but underscored this dynamic that you're talking about. Is there a way to get younger people interested, not just in some new cool project, but in all of these legacy projects? And if not, what do we
Mhm.
do?
Yeah, what I've seen work is some of the bigger projects. They have mentorship programs. They've built sandboxes. They do a lot of outreach to universities. I think things like that work. But the problem is for a lot of these overworked and burnt out maintainers, they don't have the time to set up a formal mentorship program or even just mentor the people that do come along. So a lot of what I've been thinking about is how can we help this next generation on board to open source without burdening the maintainer more, because the solutions that I see work, it's the maintainer doing more things to make their project more welcoming to Gen Z, But I don't know how we get Gen Z involved in projects where the maintainer is just too overworked to make easier pathways.
So when you spoke at the Open Source Summit, you introduced this idea, this kind of persona that you called Sam, of a kind of Gen Z coder, and what Sam would be looking for if they were to get involved in an open source project. What might be an incentive for them, and what their priorities might be, and also their limitations. Talk a little bit about Sam, who they are, and what it would take to get them more engaged in the open source community.
Yeah, and Sam was based on a lot of the published research on Gen Z. So there's some studies from Deloitte and McKinsey that I was looking at, and for a real project, maybe you should base this on some real people, but the research is pretty good too. But Sam is 23, Gen Z, they, them, self-taught on YouTube, wants to contribute to climate tech, but is a little bit intimidated by repos and how open source works generally. And this is something I saw in the research where a lot of Gen Z was self-taught on platforms like YouTube. And they were also very purpose-driven rather than... I don't know what the other, that's fine. So they're very purpose driven. So they wanted like a big mission. They wanted to understand the mission of the project and be a part of that, which is something I've seen over time, but it's more marked.
Which is an amazing quality, by the way.
Yes.
Yes, very much needed. But
yes.
Anyway, yes.
So I think making little tweaks, like making the mission of your project really prominent on your README, or if you are talking about that project, do you think try out like a video format? Because if Sam's like learning how to code on YouTube, if they see a little ad or a little clip, that might introduce them to your project. But yeah, leading with purpose, adding some visual media, and then just making it clear how that open source project works. Because every project's a little bit different. So understanding, like having clear contributing guidelines so they understand where they can contribute and how decisions are made.
And compensation. Let's talk about compensation.
Yeah. Right? Yes, that was a big thing in the research.
Yeah. So one thing about Gen Z is they got a lot more debt than previous generations, right? They've got a lot, and they got a cost of living that's probably higher than any generation in recent memory. So compensation matters a lot, but traditionally has not been a part of the open source formula. So talk about that.
No, I definitely agree. And I think the research showed, I can't remember the exact percentage, but most of Gen Z was living paycheck to paycheck. So compensation is really needed for them to have the bandwidth to contribute to open source more meaningfully. So I've seen a few experiments where projects will send little stipends to contributors, which works really well. But if you can like contract out a little bit of work, I think that would make a big difference for Gen Z.
The other thing that you talked about in your open source summit was this kind of framework called the Mountain of Engagement, which really interesting. It sort of sketches out, and thank you for doing this, it kind of sketches out this path really for a potential Gen Z contributor to follow from introductory types of experiences up into the kind of maintainer level. Talk just about kind of what that work looks like and what you think a good way to kind of operationalize that might be.
Yeah, and this is a framework that I developed with some colleagues at Mozilla, and I found it so useful. I've brought it with me to GitHub. But really, it sketches out a pathway from how a person first hears about a project, so first discovers it, all the way up to leadership and like potentially maintaining that project. So discovery could be they saw a clip on TikTok or they heard about it at a conference. It's another thing, we're seeing less Gen Z at in-person conferences. So thinking about, thinking about like where do you want to advertise your project to reach this new generation is really important. But then you need to think about the steps. Yeah, it's true. And then also they're not looking at GitHub trending, which is I thought was really interesting. But how do they get from first hearing about that project to actually contacting you? So usually that's because they're excited about what it's doing. So that's why it's so important to lead with that mission or that purpose. So for Sam, if they see a climate tech project using a language that they know, that would make them that much more likely to go into first contact. And then knowing how to actually contact someone from the project. You can drop a link to the Discord, or here's our README, or say hi at this meetup. So making it clear how someone can first contact you is really important. From first contact, how do they actually participate? When do they start making issues? When do they start actually showing up to meetups and participating? And traditionally, I think it's still true for Gen Z. It's like just being clear about how to participate. So having that good contributing guidelines, having some good first issues involved is really important. For Gen Z specifically, it's really leaning into that purpose-driven work, and maybe even offering a bit of mentorship, since it is a big barrier for them to jump into something so open. Often it's their first time doing something that openly. So mentorship can help, or providing that like smaller Discord space or that smaller closed space where they can sort of participate a little bit. So we're halfway up the mountain. I hope you're still with me. But once they're participating, how do they keep on participating? And traditionally, this is definitely still true for Gen Z. It's that recognition. So making sure that you're actually thanking people. A simple thanks goes a long way. And from the volunteerism research, I can't remember the stats. I should have looked up stats before I came on this podcast. But
don't worry about it.
Having
got them. Yeah.
Having a thanks from someone that's part of the project, a thanks and like a personal invitation, makes them far more likely to keep on participating and to keep involved in the work. And then even connecting that work to the mission, especially with Gen Z, if you can show them that like, hey, this bug that you fixed will help us fix climate science. I can't think of a better solution there, but some way to connect their tiny piece that they contributed to the bigger mission makes them far more likely to come back and just keep contributing. So once they've reached sustained participation, I find this next step is the one I'm most interested in. It's networked participation. So when do they start inviting others into the group? And that's where you really unlock a lot more growth in your project, if you can really get people in the project that are like multiplying themselves and inviting others. So that could be starting some sort of mentorship program, so then they're becoming mentors and bringing others in, or having some sort of like new contributor hackathon where they're encouraged to like bring their friends, but just encouraging people to bring others in. Very important. Then the last one's leadership. Sorry, were you going to say something there?
No, go ahead.
And that could be anything from like running a meetup to running the entire project. And that, I think, is where compensation is so important. If someone has a leadership role in your project, for Gen Z, compensation makes a really big difference in their ability to step into that role. Otherwise, they may not have the bandwidth.
Right. The data point, I think 86% of Gen Z workers prioritize mentorship and skill development. That was from the Deloitte survey. It is really interesting, because I think maybe at a high level, when people think about the open source contributors, it's sort of you're kind of a sole contributor. You're doing your work, and you're part of this larger group, but it's self-driven and and obviously self-funded. Generationally, though, Gen Z, very different. They want the mentorship, they want the engagement, they want to be part of a larger group, and like you said, cause. That is a meaningful and substantial shift, really, I'd say, from what we saw maybe 20 or 30 years ago.
I agree.
So what can an organization like GitHub do, either from a platform standpoint or just from an organizational standpoint, to promote? I mean, I think your ideas are right on. What can GitHub do to promote them? And also, organizations like Google and Meta and others that have been very supportive of the open source community, obviously rely very heavily on open source software, Microsoft as well, and have a lot of resources. What might they do to foster some of the changes that you're talking about?
For corporations, I think the number one thing is paying maintainers and getting money to these open source projects. It makes a huge difference. Exactly. Yes, open your wallet. I know GitHub has the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund, where projects get 10K to go through a security training boot camp, which I've seen it's super useful because it creates both a community of maintainers who can. Maintainers don't often get spaces to talk to each other, I find. So this creates stronger connections so people can support each other. And I think it just helps the ecosystem overall. Then they're also just securing the supply chain this way. But programs like that, I think we need from corporations. And promoting these kinds of ideas where for this, I've run several workshops with maintainers on like how to use the mountain of engagement, how to think about some personas that you want in your project and walk through that, which projects have found helpful. But helping maintainers have the bandwidth to implement these things, a lot of times they need a little bit of money so that they have the bandwidth to do that, where they just need that space. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, obviously here at ConversingLabs, we're very focused on software security, both, from a malware detection standpoint, also software supply chain security. And you and I are talking in a week where we've seen a huge attack targeting open source maintainers, phishing attack with the goal of putting cryptocurrency stealing malware in some really widely used open source packages. What are the what are the lessons, I think, from that? And what do you see as the biggest, what are some changes that you could see to make maintainers kind of less vulnerable to those types of attacks? Because now, for all of their volunteer work and effort, they're being targeted by cyber criminals and nation state actors, which just adds to the stress. So what's your takeaway from what happened this week, and what changes we might make to kind of protect maintainers a little bit from this type of thing?
Yeah, and it's tough because it was a series of attacks where it's really preying on the maintainers' wants to be more secure. It's like, oh, you're 2FA, oh, come secure this,
right.
And they so it's
that was the lure. Strengthen your account. I mean, it's ironic, but like you said, good maintainers will want to do that.
And good maintainers want to do that. They want to make things secure. They know that there's been a lot of attacks lately in the last few years, but I think it does point to this maintainers just being overworked and burned out. A lot of them, they see that and they don't have the time or the mental capacity to investigate a little bit more. They just see security and then they jump on it. But I think we need to find ways to help maintainers, just be less overworked, and so that they can be more secure.
Do you think some of the open source platforms should be almost pulling those maintainers for those big projects into almost a separate tier, where they're sort of, especially now, where it's like, listen, you're being actively targeted, you've got a huge reach, and we need to give you extra support, whether that's monetary or otherwise, to kind of help you out?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I know at GitHub, we do have a different tier for like popular projects, and they were the first to be flagged into 2FA, just knowing the importance there. But definitely, I think for these popular open source projects, we need to be supporting them. They're definitely under-resourced often, and both monetarily, but also just the in-person work that needs to be done.
Yeah. So, I think this issue around, the future and of open source is a super important question to be asking. And so I guess kind of wrapping up here, I'd ask you, with all this kind of good context that you've given us, what are the next steps? What can we do to start bending that curve and, talk 5 years from now and say, oh, actually, we've seen a big uptick in, 20 and 30 something folks getting involved in open source projects, and what's going to get us there?
Yeah, I think just starting to try a few of the techniques that might reach a Gen Z audience a little bit better. So try a little bit of video content. I know you might not want to make a TikTok, but maybe try it. Maybe join some Discord communities and talk about your project there instead of just on Mastodon, where it tends to be a little bit older. So just try a few things to reach that younger audience. And then when they do come, try to mentor them. I know maintainers are burned out, but be selective. Like, find people who are motivated by the mission of your project. They have the time. Gen Z tends to have a lot more time to give to open source than older generations.
Yeah.
And then they're willing to learn from you. So if you find
Yeah.
someone like that, take time to mentor them. And I think that will make a big difference in this curve.
Yeah. In some ways, what we see is sort of the tragedy of the commons, right? Of, these folks who have done all this amazing work, created amazing software that other people use and rely on heavily, but often, don't give back to the commons, right? Don't help support it. And the types of things you're thinking about, I think you're totally right with the TikTok videos and just changing the way the messaging. But it almost, to me, sounds like we might need some large organizations to really get involved in doing that, just collectively, right? To provide the resources and time and effort to do that, to kind of lift all boats, so to speak, because that's what will happen in my mind if we get more developers. Really
definitely
interesting.
Agree.
Yeah. Abby, is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything you wanted to say I didn't give you a chance to say?
No, this is great. Thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure to chat. Had a great conversation.
Same here, and we'd love to have you on again, talk. I'm super interested in the work that you're doing, and I think, again, the problems you're focused on are really important and deserving of our attention. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Of course. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. And thanks everyone for listening. Stay tuned. We've got more Conversing Labs episodes coming up in the next few weeks. And Abby, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again.
Of course. Yeah, happy to be here.